All right, hi guys. This is Braden with Fisherman Source here. Here today to talk to you about a couple different Fluke jigging rigs. These are going to be rigs specifically that I use fit jigging from a boat, not necessarily shore-based. That's a whole different system, a whole different everything. I see most guys fishing the same one rig in various, dimensions and various different iterations over and over and over, and that is going to be the first rig we talk about today. But there are times where it kind of makes more sense to, vary it up a little bit, or you can actually be a lot more productive by changing the rig that you're fishing, and these are the three that I really like to use. First rig we're going to talk about today is the one that everybody, standard rig that everybody uses, which is going to be either a ball jig or a bucktail jig on the bottom. 12 to 24 inches up is going to be a dropper loop and either a teaser or a teaser hook. Most guys are, fishing gulp on both of these. And this is the rig that, we see used time and time again. 90% of the guys out there jigging on a boat, this is going to be the rig they're going to use. And, honestly, most of the time it's going to be the rig that I have on as well. The one thing I would like to talk about on it specifically, though, is your dropper loop. When you tie this dropper loop, you can get a much better standout if you put a surgeon's loop in it first. It's a little trick, but it really does help avoid twisting and allow you to use the same rig longer and longer before you have to retie, or to also use lighter leaders before you get that twisting factor. Today we're using 60-pound MYLAR just so we can talk about, but just so hopefully you can see it, not necessarily that would be the leader that I'm trying to use. When I tie my dropper loops, the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to come up about 2 feet, and I'm actually going to tie a 5-turn surgeon's loop in it, and that's going to give me the base of the T standout for the dropper loop. Some guys like twisted dropper loops, that'll work here as well. Just either way, it'll actually stand out a lot better than your standard dropper. So all you do is tie a surgeon's knot with 5 loops in it or 5 wraps in it first. Then I'm going to take my dropper loop and tie it with that as the base knot for it, and it'll just allow it to stand out much better. I do this for all my sea bass rigs. I do it for cod teasers, pretty much anything where I need that leader to stand out. That is how I prefer to tie it, so we really get a good 90-degree standout of that connection. From there, whatever jig you want to put on the bottom, as light or as heavy as you want to go. I really like single large hooks for gulp up top, especially in deeper water. If we're fishing, 60 to 80 feet of water, this is, this rig is also used out in Nantucket, kind of anywhere where you're dealing with bigger fluke. Inshore, Raritan Bay, Barnegat, Manasquan, the backside of Long Island. You can do the same exact thing, but the jig is just going to be much smaller. And that's when I might use a teaser style fly. Personally, always unweighted, never weighted for the same type of situation. And I might fish something like this in shallower, skinnier water, and rather than a 5 or 6 inch gulp up top, I'm going to put a 4 inch on. I really like this rig early season Raritan Bay. But specifically, I also like this rig, both versions of this rig, when the drift is under a knot and that you can keep it relatively vertical with whatever jig weight you're trying to fish without going too heavy. So that's the standard rig that everybody's used to. The rig I actually started out jigging with, the rig I learned with, and the rig that I still use in very select situations is going to be, rather than a jig and an unweighted teaser or a plain hook, I much prefer at certain times to use a 2-jig rig. In this case, normally with me it's going to be a 3/8 ounce Spro and then whatever bucktail weight it takes to hold bottom. Coming off of a 3-way swivel, one is going to be about a 24-inch dropper to my heavier jig, and then 12 to 14 inches down to my smaller Spro. Times I really like to use this rig. Number one, skinny water where I think the fish are up on feeding on grass shrimp or spearing. Number 2 is when I need to be able to cast this rig out and not fishing it vertical. I think you can get a much better presentation where that jig is holding farther back and the smaller jig is out in front. And the third time I think this rig can really shine is when you're dealing with kind of the same situation you would fish the first rig. Deep water, big fish, however, some days they're just not chewing the way they should. We had a day last fall where we were like 60 bites into the trip, and we'd only put a few fish on the boat, and most of those were just, skin hooked right on the tip of the mouth. We knew they were there. We knew they weren't feeding correctly. A couple of us went to this rig with much smaller gulps on it, and in the last half hour of the trip, we put in multiple keepers up to 6 pounds, all on the little jig. There's just, like I said, those times where either you're up in the shallow water, casting the jig around, or you're just not getting the bite you want. You're getting a lot of swings and misses fishing those bigger gulps. Give this rig a try. It can really, it can really shine in those conditions. The last rig that I want to talk about here, and this is actually, everybody was just going to say it's a variation of a bait rig, and they are certainly correct. But the time I really like to use this rig, and the time where this rig can really shine, is when you're dealing with a much faster drift than normally you would want. I won't even consider using this rig until that drift gets over a knot. I really like it once we get to 1.2, 1.3, right up from there. One of the best days fluking I ever had happened when we were actually drifting at like 2.4 to 2.6 in deep water. We had to go to much, much heavier jigs. It's conditions that a lot of guys will just drive away from if they have to, you know, once they get to 8 ounces and, you know, you're still going over 2 knots, a lot of guys will just leave. They won't try to fish those conditions. Some of my biggest fish personally have come in those conditions, and with a very, very specific rig. In this case, it's just a basic 3-way swivel rig. However, I really like to use a style of T-turn swivel. I just find you get much less twisting and much less tangling with it. I'm going to use about a 36 or 30 to 36 inch drop back to a large hook. You can use a bait holder if you want. You can use an octopus if you want. Just something in the 6, 7, even 8.0 range. Something that once you get a big 6-inch gulp on there, you're still going to have plenty of hook points sticking out. And then on the TA clip or snap or tying direct, whatever you want, if I'm coming to this rig, it's almost always I'm using at least 6 ounces. Sometimes it's up to 8-ounce jigs. However, what will wind up happening is when you're using this much, much heavier jig and you're flying, you know, we can put, you know, I'm always going to fish this rig with a 5 or 6 inch gulp on it. Normally it's a 6 inch for the very simple reason that in these conditions, I'm not looking for little fish, number one, and number two, if they're going to come up off the bottom and try to chase it down, I have found that it normally is actually the bigger fish willing to do it. So I'm going to pull that gulp up over the hook, so that hook's coming right out at the tail. I want that hook point as far back as possible, so when they grab it, you know, they're not ripping it off. The other thing I'll say is normally when I'm fishing one of the other rigs, a lot of times I will tip this, you know, squid strip, fish strip, something of that nature. When I'm fishing this rig in that super fast current, normally I won't. And the reason I don't want to do that is I don't want to give that fish anything else to hang on to and rip off and not come back for the rest of the bait. I find that in those conditions, if they hit it and miss it, they very rarely come back because normally they've ripped something off or they maybe rip the tail off the gulp. Once they have part of that bait in their mouth, they're not going to continue with the bite if you're drifting that fast. However, when you do get fish that are willing to come up and hit this bait in that fast current, normally they are big. I'm going to say the average fish we hook on this rig is over 3 pounds, not under. And number two, even though we're talking about it fishing at a very fast drift speed, normally they're hooked quite solidly in the mouth because by the time they're willing to come up and chase this bait at that speed, they're willing to actually really eat it. We've had times where fish with literally no drop back have managed to swallow a 6-inch gulp traveling at, you know, over 2 knots. It's just they get that aggressive on that bait. It's a really good thing to pull out late in the day if that south wind comes up. You were on fish, but all of a sudden the south wind comes up. You can't hold bottom anymore. It's changing your drift speed. Do a drift or two with a rig like this. It might, you know, you might only get 1 or 2 bites, but chances are the bites you're going to get are going to be those quality fish. All right, guys, so that's pretty much, you know, the way I prefer to do my boat jigging for fluke. Like I said, it's almost always a variation of one of these rigs. I didn't touch on things like the chicken rig or things that, you know, is going to involve primarily a sinker. You know, everything that I'm talking about here, the only weight I'm going to put on the line is the jig or the fluke ball itself. It's not the only way to do it. They work very well for me. And chances are, if you're overfish, you know, one of these 3 variations of the rig can, you know, really get you on them in a good manner. Don't be afraid to change it up. Don't be afraid to experiment a little bit, longer drop backs. Don't be afraid to send your top teaser up even higher off the bottom, especially if you're in real sticky bottom. Don't be afraid to bring that teaser up higher where they can see it on the other side of a rock or a rock pile. Hope you guys learned a little bit of something here. Any other questions or, you know, any issues, please let us know, and hope to see you soon. Thank you.